Disclaimer: this story is a work of creative, narrative nonfiction inspired by real-life themes of relationships and infidelity. It began as an evening like any other, the kind of night you don't expect to remember. The television was humming softly in the background, the room dim except for the pale glow of the screen. I had curled myself onto the far end of the couch, half distracted by the flickering colors of the program, half absorbed in my own thoughts. He sat beside me, close enough to feel his presence, but not so close that it felt unusual. After all, we'd sat like this before, sharing the silence, sharing the room, without anything significant happening. It was ordinary, safe, and harmless. At least, that's what I told myself. The air was calm, the kind of stillness that only comes late in the evening when the world outside feels distant. I remember the faint ticking of a clock, the occasional laugh track from the television, and the subtle rustle whenever he shifted in his seat. Nothing about it should have felt remarkable. But that night, the ordinary carried a tension I couldn't name. I noticed, almost unconsciously, how close his arm rested on the cushion, how his shoulder leaned ever so slightly in my direction. It wasn't enough to alarm me, it was the kind of closeness people explain away. Still, there was something about it that made me more aware of my own body, of the space we were sharing. I told myself it was nothing. That people brush against one another all the time, that sitting side by side is no different from standing together in a crowded room. But deep down, I knew I was noticing details that I shouldn't have been paying attention to. My chest rose a little quicker with each breath. My eyes lingered on the screen, but I wasn't following the storyline. Instead, I was listening, waiting, anticipating something I couldn't quite name. And then it happened. His hand, almost casually, slipped against mine on the couch. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't forceful, and maybe to anyone else it would have seemed like nothing at all, an accident, a clumsy shift of weight. But in that single moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. I felt the warmth of his skin against mine, and time seemed to slow down. The television blurred into background noise. All I could register was the silent pressure of his touch, the heat radiating where his hand had fallen. I froze. I didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't say a word. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it really was an accident. Maybe he didn't even notice. Maybe I was overthinking. But beneath those excuses, another thought pulsed quietly. Why haven't I moved? It was such a small thing, so insignificant on the surface, yet it carried weight I couldn't ignore. That simple, accidental slip of a hand became something larger than either of us admitted. And though I could have brushed it off, shifted, laughed, or pretended nothing had happened, I sat there still, my body refusing to retreat. The night that began as ordinary suddenly wasn't. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just let something begin. The instant his hand brushed against mine, I expected something, an apology, a quick retreat, a shift that would erase the contact. But it didn't come. Instead, the moment stretched, longer than it should have, as though both of us had silently agreed not to acknowledge it. The television continued its chatter, actors delivering lines I couldn't hear, laughter echoing from a world that felt far away. All I could sense was the warmth of his skin, steady, real, and impossibly close. I sat frozen, caught between instinct and hesitation. A part of me screamed that I should move, pull my hand back, break the tension before it grew into something I couldn't control. But another part, the quieter, more dangerous part, told me to stay still. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was something I didn't want to name. Whatever it was, it kept me rooted in place. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just let it be. The silence between us grew heavy. Not the kind of silence that's awkward, but the kind that hums, alive with unspoken meaning. My ears caught the faint rhythm of his breathing, slower than mine, steadier. I could feel the subtle tension in the air, as if even the room itself was aware of the shift. The tick of the clock grew louder in my head, each second dragging as if it wanted me to make a choice. I searched for excuses. Perhaps it was only an accident, I thought again. Perhaps I was imagining the intent behind it. If I stayed still, if I didn't react, maybe the moment would dissolve into nothing. But deep down, I knew better. His hand hadn't moved away. It stayed where it was, light but deliberate, and I knew that if he had truly meant it as nothing, he would have pulled back instantly. He didn't. And I didn't either. Inside, guilt began to stir. I thought of my partner, of loyalty, of all the boundaries I swore I would never let blur. But guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, allowing other feelings to grow alongside it. And in that moment, as much as I hated to admit it, there was a flicker of thrill. The kind of thrill that comes from doing something forbidden, from standing at the edge of a cliff and leaning just slightly forward. I didn't speak. Neither did he. And that silence spoke louder than any words could have. It was a silence filled with questions, with possibilities, with an acknowledgement that something had shifted between us. A silence that suggested we both knew, even without saying, that we were no longer in the safe territory of before. I stared at the TV, unseeing, my heart thudding harder with each passing second. And as the minutes crawled on, I realized something that made my breath catch. By not moving, by not stopping it, I had already made my choice. The silence should have ended it. A small slip, a hand left too long in the wrong place, and then retreat. That would have been the natural course, the safe return to normalcy. But instead, the silence became something else, an invitation neither of us voiced, but both of us heard. My body remained still, my gaze fixed on the television, though the images flashing across the screen no longer held any meaning. What I felt instead was the presence of him beside me, a presence that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. It began with the faintest pressure, a shift so subtle that I might have convinced myself I was imagining it. His hand, once accidentally resting against mine, adjusted just enough to graze my skin again, this time softer, slower, unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't the kind of clumsy contact that could be brushed aside as coincidence. This was different. This was intent. My pulse quickened, thudding against my ribs in uneven beats. I didn't look at him, couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing screen, as though focusing hard enough would shield me from what was happening beside me. But no amount of pretending could erase the truth. He had crossed an invisible line, and I was letting him. Inside, a storm of thoughts clashed. Pull away. Say something. End this before it begins. The rational part of me shouted commands, but my body betrayed me. I didn't move. My fingers stayed still, my breath shallow, my shoulders rigid but unresisting. It was as though I had surrendered control to a quiet, dangerous curiosity, a willingness to see what might happen if I didn't stop it. The atmosphere between us grew dense, charged with an energy I couldn't deny. The laughter from the television sounded hollow, disconnected, almost mocking. Every sense sharpened, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the soft friction of fabric as he shifted again, closer this time. It was all happening in fragments, slow enough to disguise itself as nothing, yet heavy enough to change everything. And still, neither of us spoke. Words would have shattered the illusion, forced us to confront what was unfolding. But silence gave us cover. Silence allowed us to pretend that nothing was happening even as everything was. I realized then how fragile boundaries really are, not made of brick or stone, but of thin, invisible threads that can snap with the slightest tug. One careless touch, one moment of weakness, and years of loyalty could unravel. And yet, instead of recoiling at that truth, I found myself leaning into it, pulled by something I didn't fully understand. When his hand brushed again, a deliberate echo of the first slip, my breath caught. It was no longer an accident. It was a choice. And though I didn't reach for him, though I didn't return the touch, my stillness was its own form of permission. By the time I realized it, the shift had already happened. We were no longer just sitting together. We were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. Stillness can feel heavier than movement. That night, it pressed down on me like a blanket, suffocating and intoxicating all at once. I didn't move. He didn't move. And yet the air between us shifted with every second that passed. My body was painfully aware of his hand, of the closeness we both pretended to ignore. Each breath I took sounded too loud in my own ears. each beat of my heart like a confession I hadn't spoken. I kept asking myself the same question: why didn't I move? It wasn't as though I was trapped. A small shift of my arm, a nervous laugh, even the simple act of standing up to fetch a glass of water could have ended it. But I stayed, rooted. And the longer I stayed, the heavier the silence became. Memories rose unbidden, as though summoned by that weight. I thought of my relationship, of the quiet cracks that had formed over the years, conversations cut short, evenings spent apart, affection rationed in smaller and smaller doses. Loneliness has a way of sharpening the edges of temptation, and in that moment, I felt them cutting into me. The hand against mine wasn't just a slip anymore. It was a reminder of something I'd been missing, something I had almost forgotten I needed. Guilt curled inside me, sharp and relentless. I thought of promises made, of trust given so freely by the person who wasn't in that room. The realization should have jolted me, should have snapped me out of the haze. But guilt didn't push me away, it bound me tighter. Because alongside the guilt was another truth. I liked the attention. I liked the warmth, the silent acknowledgement that someone noticed me, wanted me, even in a way neither of us dared to name. The television droned on, filling the silence with hollow sound, but the story on the screen no longer mattered. Our story had begun in the quiet, in the space between two still bodies and one unanswered choice. His hand shifted again, not much, just the slightest brush that lingered a heartbeat too long. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, and this time I couldn't deny it. A tremor passed through me, not of fear but of recognition. We had crossed from chance into intention, from innocence into danger. And the worst part wasn't that he had crossed that line, it was that I hadn't stopped him. I sat there, carrying the weight of stillness like a secret no one else could see. On the outside, we looked the same. Two people watching television, sharing a couch, doing nothing extraordinary. But inside, something had shifted irrevocably. Every second I chose silence, I was choosing more than silence. I was choosing to let this happen. And as his hand rested closer, no longer pretending to be lost, I realized the truth I didn't want to face. Sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with passion, or even with words. Sometimes it begins with stillness, with the refusal to move, with the choice to say nothing at all. There comes a moment when pretending no longer works, when silence can't disguise the truth of what is happening. For me, that moment arrived when his hand brushed mine again, not by chance, not by accident, but with intention. The subtlety was gone now. The boundary that once felt strong, almost unbreakable, had thinned to a fragile thread, and with one more touch, it snapped. The air in the room shifted, thick with an unspoken awareness. I felt his fingers linger, tracing just enough to make me shiver, though neither of us dared to meet the other's eyes. The television played on, blind to what was unfolding inches away from its glow. It should have been the easiest thing to do, to stand up, to laugh it off, to make space. But I didn't. I let it happen. Inside, I was battling myself. One part of me screamed warnings: stop this now. You know where it leads. You'll regret it. But another part, darker and quieter, whispered seductively, just a little longer. Just see where it goes. That whisper won, not because it was stronger, but because I wanted it to. I wanted to feel something I hadn't in a long time, desired, noticed, alive. He shifted slightly closer, closing the distance that had once been a cushion of safety between us. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the deliberate stillness in his movements, as if waiting for me to either recoil or remain. And I remained. My stillness became permission. My silence became complicity. The sound of footsteps upstairs made my heart jolt. For a moment, I thought of what it would mean if someone walked in, if the fragile illusion of innocence shattered under a sudden light. That fear should have been enough to end it. But strangely, it only intensified the pull. The risk made it sharper, more dangerous, more intoxicating. The knowledge that what we were doing was wrong didn't stop me, it tied me to it even more. I told myself that nothing real had happened yet. That it was only a hand, only silence, only stillness. But deep down I knew the truth. Lines don't need grand gestures to be crossed. Sometimes all it takes is the decision not to stop what you know you should. Sometimes betrayal begins in these tiny increments, these invisible trespasses that build until they can't be ignored. When his fingers brushed against mine again, lingering, deliberate, I finally allowed myself to face it. This was no longer a mistake. It was a choice. His choice to reach out. My choice to stay. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Once you cross one invisible line, the others don't look so far away anymore. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes, it enters the room quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door. That night, it came in silence, in the way his hand lingered on mine, and the way I chose not to pull away. No words were spoken, no vows were broken aloud, yet I knew with chilling clarity that I had already stepped into a place I couldn't deny. His touch grew bolder, though still restrained, like a secret he was testing in small doses. A slow shift of his fingers, the faintest graze against my palm, a hesitation that asked a question without sound. And my stillness was the answer. I didn't recoil, didn't protest, didn't give him reason to stop. I let him ask again, and each time my silence agreed. The weight of guilt settled over me, heavy and suffocating. In my mind, images of my partner flickered, smiles, promises, the steady trust one had been given so freely. I should have felt only horror at what I was allowing, but the truth was more complicated. Alongside the guilt, there was a thrill that I couldn't dismiss. The wrongness of it made it sharper, more consuming. Each brush of his hand was a reminder not only of the betrayal, but also of how alive I suddenly felt, how rare it was to be seen and wanted in this quiet, undeniable way. I hated myself for it. And yet I leaned into it. Not outwardly, not with obvious gestures, but with the smallest betrayals, by not moving, by not speaking, by letting his touch become familiar. That was the cruelty of it. I could pretend nothing had happened, that I hadn't done anything, and yet the betrayal was already written in silence. The room itself seemed complicit, wrapping us in shadows. The TV's glow painted everything in pale light, masking what was happening in a way that made it feel safe, almost invisible. But inside me, it was loud. Every beat of my heart thundered like a warning, every shallow breath felt like an admission of guilt. And still, I didn't stop it. There was a moment, small, fleeting, when I thought about speaking, about breaking the spell. A word, even a nervous laugh, would have scattered the tension. But I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, the betrayal deepened, not with passion or declarations, but with complicity. He shifted a little closer, his arm brushing against mine as if claiming a place he knew he shouldn't. I felt the warmth, the steadiness, the deliberate nature of it. And though no one else would ever see, though no one else would ever know, I knew that line had already been crossed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't even physical in the way people might imagine. But it was betrayal all the same. A betrayal not shouted in action, but whispered in silence. And as his hand rested there, steady and unchallenged, I heard myself think a truth I couldn't ignore. I still didn't move. The program on the television ended, its final scene fading into darkness before another began. The sudden shift in light and sound snapped me back into awareness, as though the world was reminding me that time was still moving forward. My hand remained where it was, his still close, the space between us charged and fragile. For a moment, neither of us breathed too deeply, afraid the quiet spell might shatter. Then, as naturally as it had started, he leaned back slightly, as if retreating into the safety of ordinary gestures. His hand slipped away, leaving behind the ghost of its warmth on my skin. The absence was startling. My fingers tingled where his had been, and without the contact, I felt both relief and loss. The silence stretched, no longer heavy with anticipation but awkward, unspoken, and undeniable. I tried to focus on the screen, but the colors blurred into meaningless patterns. My mind replayed the last hour in fragments, the slip, the stillness, the deliberate touches, my lack of resistance. The reel looped endlessly, each memory reminding me of the truth I didn't want to say out loud. I had betrayed someone I loved without ever speaking a word or making a promise to him. And yet the betrayal was real. It lived in my silence, in my willingness to let the moment grow. When he shifted on the couch, straightening as though preparing to leave, my chest tightened. I should have been grateful that the moment was ending, that the dangerous closeness was dissolving back into the ordinary. But instead, I felt an ache, a hollow pull I couldn't explain. As wrong as it was, some part of me wished he wouldn't go, that the silence might stretch longer, that the weight of it might press down just one more time. He looked at me briefly, a glance so quick it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been waiting for it. His eyes carried the same truth mine did. We both knew. We both understood what had passed between us, even if no one else ever would. No words were exchanged, no acknowledgement given, but the glance was enough. It was a silent pact, a recognition that something had changed, and it could never be undone. When he finally stood and said a casual goodnight, his voice sounded too normal, too safe. It clashed with the chaos in my chest. I managed a nod, a faint smile, as though nothing unusual had happened. He walked away, and the sound of his footsteps faded, leaving me alone with the hum of the television and the crushing weight of my thoughts. The room looked the same. The couch was the same. The television still glowed. But everything inside me felt altered. A secret had taken root, one that would grow in silence. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, staring blankly at the screen, and realized something chilling. Life had returned to normal on the surface, but beneath it, nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, I found myself haunted less by what had happened and more by what hadn't. No kiss had been shared, no words of desire spoken, no bold betrayal for anyone to see. And yet, the memory of his hand on mine clung to me like a shadow, impossible to shake. It replayed at the quietest moments, when I sat alone, when I lay in bed beside the person I loved, when the television flickered at night. The silence of that evening followed me everywhere. I wondered endlessly if silence could be considered betrayal. Could you betray someone without ever saying yes, without ever reaching back? Or was betrayal born the instant you chose not to stop what you knew was wrong? My mind turned circles around these questions, each answer cutting deeper. I hadn't acted, not in the way people usually define infidelity. But I had also not resisted. And in that choice, I had been unfaithful in a way words couldn't capture. At times, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. That people brush hands all the time. That silence means nothing if nothing real followed. But deep down, I knew better. What made that night dangerous wasn't what happened. It was what I allowed to happen. It was the permission I gave through stillness, the quiet hunger I didn't name but didn't fight. The betrayal had been woven into every second I stayed frozen, every moment I chose silence instead of honesty. I thought about confessing, about unburdening myself to my partner. I imagined the words tumbling out, hesitant, clumsy, stained with guilt. It wasn't anything, but it was something. I didn't stop him. I didn't move. But the more I rehearsed it in my head, the more I realized how impossible it would be to explain. How could I make someone understand that betrayal doesn't always leave physical evidence, that sometimes it's written only in glances, in touches that linger, in silences that last too long? How could I confess something that looked invisible to the world but felt monumental to me? And so I chose silence once more. I carried it, tucked away inside me, hidden beneath the routine of daily life. To everyone else, nothing had changed. But I knew. He knew. That moment on the couch would live between us, unspoken, a fragile ghost that hovered whenever we crossed paths. Sometimes, I catch myself wondering if I'll ever forgive myself for that night. Not for doing too much, but for doing too little, for not standing up, for not pulling away, for not choosing clarity over temptation. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it comes in whispers and hesitation, in the choice to remain still when you should have moved. And so the story ends not with passion, not with destruction, but with a silence that still echoes. A silence that became my confession, my secret, my quiet betrayal. A silence that will always remind me, sometimes infidelity begins not with action, but with the choice to say nothing at all. 1.